17 Black R&B legends who were blacklisted that you didn't know about. What if your favorite song was actually a crime scene behind the velvet curtains of R&B? A blacklist exists not as a myth, but as a cold corporate guillotine. We aren't talking about artists who simply faded away. We are talking about legends like Sam Cooke and Donny Hathaway, whose voices were silenced the moment they demanded the keys to their own kingdoms. From accidental falls to mysterious master tape disappearances, the industry has a dark recipe for erasing black brilliance that refuses to bow. Are you ready to see the blood on the ledger? Welcome to Black Excellence Legends. Before we expose the truth, the labels tried to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Help us break the silence, because history only belongs to those who dare to remember. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway was arguably the most gifted architect of soul music, possessing a velvet-toned voice that bridged the gap between gospel roots and classical sophistication. His brilliance, however, became a double-edged sword within a predatory industry. By the late 1970s, Hathaway began demanding structural shifts that terrified label executives: full creative autonomy and absolute financial transparency. He refused to remain a mere commodity on a balance sheet, asserting that his spiritual essence could never be purchased. This defiance placed him directly in the crosshairs of powerful gatekeepers who preferred compliant stars. The psychological toll of being monitored by invisible forces led to a deepening sense of isolation. According to his confidants, Hathaway kept a brown suitcase filled with clandestine recordings of corporate meetings intending to expose the systematic exploitation of black musicians. On the tragic night of January 13, 1979, his body was discovered on the sidewalk beneath his 15th floor room at the Essex House Hotel. While authorities quickly closed the case as a suicide, the anomalies were staggering. He was found still wearing his headphones, and witnesses recalled him frantically reporting a break-in to reclaim his documents. Following his demise, the industry's erasure was swift. His final recordings vanished, and his family saw virtually none of the royalties from the posthumous compilations that flooded the market. Hathaway didn't just pass away, he was effectively excommunicated for daring to challenge the ledger. Today, he remains a patron saint for independent artists, a reminder that the most profound voices are often the ones the establishment tries hardest to muffle. Esther Phillips. Esther Phillips was a vocal powerhouse whose raspy, emotive delivery carried the grit of the Texas blues and the elegance of jazz. Discovered as a teenage prodigy under the moniker Little Esther, her trajectory was initially defined by chart-topping success, yet her later years became a haunting testament to industry vengeance. Unlike many who suffered in silence, Phillips possessed a sharp, unyielding tongue. She viewed her performances not merely as entertainment, but as reporting from the front lines of her own survival. This commitment to honesty proved fatal to her career in 1972, during a seismic moment at a concert in Harlem. Mid-performance, Phillips paused the music to deliver a devastating testimony, publicly accusing her label managers of sexual assault. The revelation stunned the industry to its core. Rather than receiving support, the backlash was immediate and surgical. Within 24 hours, local media minimized her trauma as unproven allegations, and major venues began withdrawing invitations, fearing litigation or corporate fallout. An internal memo leaked years later confirmed the chilling consensus: she talked too much. Her recording contracts were unceremoniously shredded, and her upcoming projects were permanently mothballed. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond the stage. A freelance investigator, Marcus Hilton, who had secured a recording of Phillips lamenting how the industry controlled her life as strictly as her painkillers, perished in a suspicious house fire before his expose could reach the public. By the time of her passing in 1984, the system had effectively ghosted her. She died without her copyright stripped of her audience and erased from the accolades she rightfully deserved. Esther Phillips' legacy serves as a somber reminder that in the high-stakes world of music, the truth is often treated as a liability, and those who refuse to bury it are frequently buried themselves. Sly Stone. Sly Stone was the visionary architect of psychedelic funk, a boundary-breaking genius who envisioned a family stone where race and gender were unified through rhythm. As the leader of the 1960s cultural zeitgeist, his influence was titanic, yet his downfall was accelerated by his refusal to become a corporate puppet. The industry began to view Stone as a liability when his music shifted from the optimistic, everyday people to the dark, politically charged realism of "there's a riot going on." By demanding total ownership of his masters and rejecting lucrative sponsorship deals, including a major liquor contract he felt would degrade his message, Stone became a target for institutional dismantling. The blacklist against him was subtle but devastating. After he used his platform on national television to criticize the gatekeepers of color who controlled the industry, his media presence was systematically strangled. Legendary stories of his erratic behavior were often amplified by the press to mask the fact that major tours were being canceled by promoters behind his back. In 1975, a radio DJ was reportedly fired for playing the unedited version of Family Affair after the station received pressure from high-level executives. This wasn't just a battle with addiction. It was an organized campaign to portray a brilliant social critic as a madman. For decades, Stone lived in a van in Los Angeles, a startling visual of a legend erased in real time. He wasn't destitute because of a lack of talent, but because he had been ignored by too many deaf people in power. Even as his funk DNA was sampled to create the foundation of hip-hop, the industry ensured he remained a fringe figure, denied the royalties and respect his innovations earned. Sly Stone remains the ultimate symbol of the artist who fought the system only to have the system make him look crazy, proving that for the establishment, a silent legend is far safer than a vocal one. Fontella Bass. Fontella Bass possessed a gospel-drenched, thunderous mezzo-soprano that defined the mid-1960s soul explosion. Her masterpiece, Rescue Me, became an international anthem, yet it also became the instrument of her professional imprisonment. Despite co-writing the iconic hook and defining the song's vocal arrangement, Bass discovered that her name was systematically omitted from the official legal credits. The industry's machinery had orchestrated a royalty heist, assigning ownership to executives who weren't even present during the recording sessions. When Bass dared to confront Chess Records to demand her rightful share, she wasn't met with a negotiation, but with a total blockade. The retaliation for her defiance was swift and surgical. Within months of her inquiry, her entire tour itinerary was canceled without explanation. The establishment sought to decouple her voice from her identity. She became a ghost singer in the very industry she helped sustain. During a televised appearance in Georgia, the organizers refused to introduce her by name, listing her on promotional posters simply as the surprise guest voice of Rescue Me. It was a psychological tactic designed to remind her that while the public loved the sound, the corporate structure owned the person. This enforced anonymity pushed her into a state of professional collapse as her former collaborators were pressured into silence. Exhausted by the litigation and the industry's cold shoulder, Bass eventually retreated to the sanctuary of the church, leaving the mainstream stage behind. She famously remarked that while they could steal her songs, they could never reclaim the pain she carried or the soul that birthed the music. Her story remains a chilling case study in creative theft, where a Black woman's intellectual property was treated as a harvestable resource rather than a human right. Fontella Bass stood her ground against a monolith, and though they silenced her name for decades, the raw power of her uncredited rescue continues to haunt the airwaves. Billy Paul. Billy Paul was a jazz-influenced soul baritone whose sophisticated elegance defined the Philadelphia sound. While he achieved global immortality with Me and Mrs. Jones, his professional trajectory was violently derailed when he pivoted toward radical social commentary. The industry's discomfort reached a breaking point with the release of Let's Make a Baby in 1976. Though the title appeared romantic, the lyrics functioned as a revolutionary manifesto, whispering about Black procreation as a direct counteraction to the programmed death inflicted upon his community. The establishment perceived a Black man advocating for the creation of life and the strengthening of the family unit as a far greater threat than a standard protest slogan. The censorship mechanism was swift and multi-layered. Within a week of the song's debut, an internal morality warning was circulated by broadcasting authorities, placing the track on an informal red list. Radio stations were pressured to suppress its airplay under the guise of protecting family values. Despite the song's gentle prayer-like delivery, The betrayal deepened when his own label withdrew all promotional support, explicitly informing employees that the song was too political to market. Paul's scheduled fall tour was unceremoniously dismantled, and he faced the ultimate indignity in Chicago, where he was physically escorted out of a venue by security to be replaced by a white country artist, despite being backstage in full costume. This systematic erasure turned Billy Paul into a visible ghost. While his past hits continued to generate revenue for corporations, his physical presence was scrubbed from mainstream television and contemporary campaigns. He was allowed to remain a voice on the radio, provided his face and current convictions remained hidden from the public eye. This tactic of decapitating an artist's influence while still profiting from their catalog became a blueprint for industry control. Billy Paul's legacy stands as a testament to the fact that in a world controlled by silent suppression, singing about the sanctity of life can be the most dangerous act of rebellion an artist can perform. Ike Turner. Ike Turner was the seismic architect of rock and roll, credited with steering the genre's birth through the 1951 masterpiece Rocket 88. His technical prowess as a multi-instrumentalist and scout defined the golden era of St. Louis soul. However, his legacy became a complex battleground between undeniable musical innovation and extreme personal transgression. While his domestic abuse of Tina Turner was rightfully condemned, the industry utilized his genuine flaws as a convenient pretext for a total cultural purge. By the late 1980s, a moral blacklist was weaponized against him, extending far beyond social accountability into the realm of historical erasure. The institutional campaign to dismantle Turner's influence was remarkably efficient. Major television networks and advertising sponsors issued internal directives to scrub his name from promotional deals, citing inappropriate branding as a catch-all justification. Documentary filmmakers attempting to chronicle his pivotal role in shaping modern R&B saw their funding evaporate and distribution channels blocked by media conglomerates. Even educational texts on musicology were reportedly pressured to omit his contributions to avoid corporate fallout. This was a surgical excommunication. The industry sought to retain the sonic foundations he built while permanently removing the man from the narrative, effectively decapitating his status as a pioneer. Turner frequently lamented that if he were not a black man, the system might have allowed for a distinction between his artistic genius and his personal failings. He became a cautionary tale of how the establishment can use a celebrity's dark past to justify the confiscation of their future and their history. While he remained a talent locked in a box of his own, making the industry's refusal to acknowledge his fundamental impact created a void in the lineage of American music. Ike Turner died in 2007 as a pariah, illustrating the industry's terrifying power to turn a founding father into a nameless footnote when his presence no longer serves the corporate aesthetic. Betty Wright. Betty Wright was a soul firebrand whose 5-octave range in whistle register earned her the title of Miami's musical queen. Beyond her chart-topping success with Clean Up Woman, she functioned as an unofficial guardian for younger artists, mentoring talent, while navigating a treacherous corporate landscape. Her downfall within the mainstream infrastructure was triggered by her refusal to stay silent regarding the systemic predation she witnessed. In 1989, at an industry conference, Wright utilized her platform to expose the casting couch culture of the era, describing how managers coerced young performers into sexual favors in exchange for studio time. This breach of the industry's code of silence transformed her from a celebrated icon into a perceived liability overnight. The retaliation was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. Within days of her public statements, major television networks began declining her bookings without providing specific justifications. A completed solo album was indefinitely placed on hold by her label, a tactic designed to starve an artist of both income and relevance. Wright's voice was further muffled during late-night radio broadcasts. Recordings of her interviews were frequently truncated or suffered technical glitches whenever she addressed the industry's dark underbelly. An internal circle of power comprised of influential producers and publicists reportedly placed her name at the top of a non-cooperation list, ensuring that the doors to high-level collaborations remained firmly locked. Despite the boycott, Wright maintained her defiance, famously noting in her diary, that she wasn't being punished for being wrong, but for being too real. The establishment attempted to bury her legacy by denying her Grammy nominations after 1988, yet she continued to operate as an independent force, teaching the next generation that a microphone is a weapon of truth. When she attempted to enter her longtime studio and found her access badge deactivated, the guard's explanation was simple. The system had changed, and her name was no longer on the list. Betty Wright's struggle highlights the immense courage required to challenge the music industry's taboo of silence, proving that the brightest lights are often the first ones the system tries to extinguish. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke was the definitive architect of soul, a man whose transition from gospel royalty to pop superstardom provided the blueprint for the modern Black artist entrepreneur. However, it was his tactical brilliance offstage that marked him as a target for institutional destruction. By 1963, Cooke had recognized that talent without ownership was merely a refined form of servitude. He founded SAR Records and CAGS Music, ensuring that Black musicians retained their publishing rights and controlled their financial destinies. In a segregated era where the industry functioned on the systematic theft of Black intellectual property, Cooke's move to bypass white middlemen was viewed by the establishment as an economic insurrection. The pressure on Cooke escalated as his artistic vision merged with the civil rights movement. He utilized his immense wealth to sponsor Martin Luther King Jr.'s marches and wrote, "A change is gonna come," as a direct challenge to the American status quo. The industry responded with a coordinated, soft boycott. Major television contracts were abruptly rescinded, and radio stations began receiving subtle directives to reduce his rotation. An attorney later revealed that Cooke sat atop an internal list of high-risk artist individuals whose financial independence threatened the corporate hierarchy. His ambition to create a national Black musicians union signaled a shift from being a singer to becoming a kingmaker, a transition the power structure could not tolerate. The tragic finale occurred on December 11, 1964, at the Hacienda Motel. Cooke was shot dead under highly suspicious circumstances that were quickly ruled justifiable homicide by authorities. Crucially, a briefcase containing sensitive documents regarding his upcoming union projects and financial audits of major labels vanished from the scene. The investigation was perfunctory, leaving a void where a legend once stood. While the industry continued to profit from his catalog, they attempted to sanitize his legacy, stripping away the revolutionary businessman and leaving only the king of soul. Sam Cooke's life remains a powerful warning in the music business. A voice that commands the charts is welcomed, but a mind that commands the ledgers is often silenced. Marlena Shaw. Marlena Shaw was a vocal titan whose stylistic fluidity allowed her to navigate the worlds of jazz, soul, and disco with unparalleled grace. Her definitive recording, California Soul, remains an enduring cultural touchstone, yet her career trajectory was deliberately throttled when she challenged the industry's fetishization of the Black female image. In 1981, Shaw entered a lucrative partnership with a major beverage conglomerate only to discover that the corporate strategy involved a profound erasure of her physical identity. The final advertisement featured Shaw's evocative vocals, but the visual focused exclusively on a younger model in a bikini. When Shaw demanded that her face be associated with her voice, asserting that her artistry was inseparable from her personhood, the establishment viewed her as a difficult asset. The corporate retaliation was clinical and immediate. Within days of her public protest, her scheduled high-profile television appearances were canceled under the vague guise of realigning brand strategy. Internal communications from a media giant later surfaced explicitly flagging Shaw as not in line with public relations objectives. This institutionalized silence meant that her subsequent albums received zero promotional backing, and her existing catalog was quietly moved to the back rooms of distribution warehouses. The industry attempted to reduce one of the most distinctive voices of a generation into a nameless audio track, proving that for major labels, a Black woman's talent was harvestable only if she remained a silent partner in her own marketing. Despite the systematic neglect, Marlena Shaw refused to provide the industry with the apology it demanded. She spent the later stages of her career performing on her own terms, famously stating that she would rather sing with her integrity intact than inhabit a distorted image for a paycheck. By the time of her passing in 2024, She had outlived many of the executives who tried to bury her. She remained a symbol of authenticity in a world of manufactured veneers, teaching future generations that the soul cannot be edited. And a true artist's voice is one that no corporate filter can ever truly mute. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye was the quintessential prophet of soul, a man who transformed from a tailored Motown hitmaker into a revolutionary voice of social conscience. His 1971 masterpiece, What's Going On, remains the most significant shift in Black music history, yet it marked the beginning of his status as a dangerous intellectual within the corporate machine. Berry Gordy initially refused to release the title track, calling it too political and uncommercial. When the album became a global phenomenon against all odds, the industry's response was not celebration, but containment. The establishment recognized that a Black artist who could command both the charts and the moral compass of a nation was a threat to the status quo. The blacklisting of Marvin Gaye was a subtle internal strangulation. While his music was too popular to be banned outright, his professional mobility was systematically restricted. A scheduled national tour was mysteriously cut in half, with radio executives later admitting they were warned that Gaye's new material would incite undesirable reactions in a tense political climate. His subsequent creative endeavors were met with institutional delays, budget freezes, and editorial interference. Gaye famously wrote in his diary that he felt he was being strangled by an invisible hand, observing how the industry favored his sensual loveman persona while actively suppressing his role as a political visionary. This corporate pressure, combined with internal struggles, pushed Gaye into a period of tax-induced exile and professional isolation. The industry continued to harvest his earlier safe hits while making it increasingly difficult for him to distribute his more radical observations. His tragic death in 1984 at the hands of his father provided a convenient end to a narrative the establishment could no longer control. However, the industry's attempt to sanitize his legacy into a mere collection of bedroom ballads failed. Marvin Gaye's struggle proved that when a Black artist dares to ask, "What's going on?" the system's instinctive response is to ensure that no one hears the answer. Linda Jones. Linda Jones possessed a vocal instrument of unparalleled intensity, a soaring melismatic soprano that could transition from a whisper to a hurricane in a single breath. Known for her gospel-inflected clutching style, she was a rising star whose career was systematically sabotaged when she refused to accept the industry's terms of total subjugation. In 1971, a dominant record label presented her with a contract that functioned as a legal trap, demanding ownership of all future recordings and the complete forfeiture of co-writing credits. Jones, embodying a rare spirit of independence, famously scrawled the words, "No voice for silence," across the document and walked away. This act of defiance made her a target for an industry-wide blockade. The consequences of her refusal were immediate and devastating. Her manager, under pressure from corporate stakeholders, abruptly terminated their partnership, causing her national tour dates to vanish overnight. In New Jersey, radio DJs reported receiving directives to limit her airplay, a soft blacklist intended to diminish her market value until she was forced to return to the bargaining table. The most chilling chapter of her erasure occurred on the day of her death in 1972. While recording a powerful ballad titled My Rights to Love, a song reportedly about reclaiming one's identity from those who seek to steal it, Jones collapsed in a makeshift studio. Despite her known struggle with diabetes, the studio lacked basic medical equipment, and the circumstances surrounding the loss of her final master tapes remain a dark industry secret. Following her passing at just 27, the establishment completed her erasure by allowing her legacy to drift into obscurity. The sound engineer present during her final session was quickly hired by the very label she had rejected, and the recording of her defiant final song was never found. The press reduced her complex life to a brief headline about medical complications, ignoring the professional strangulation she faced in her final months. Linda Jones was a traitor to the industry's demand for obedience. She died protecting the sanctity of her voice, leaving behind a haunting question of what might have been if the system valued talent more than control. Rick James. Rick James was the black hurricane of funk, a high-octane rebel who fused streetwise grit with stadium-sized theatricality. He dominated the early 1980s, revitalizing Motown with a raw punk-funko aesthetic that challenged the sanitized standards of pop music. However, his meteoric rise hit a titanium wall when his unapologetic black masculinity collided with the conservative gatekeepers of mainstream media. Following his legendary 1981 performance of Super Freak, which featured sexually charged choreography and defiant lyrics, a clandestine meeting of major network executives reportedly took place. The consensus was chilling. James was deemed too aggressive and uncontrollable for primetime audiences. Overnight, he was systematically purged from American television. The blacklist was disguised as a moral crusade. Within weeks of the industry summit, Rick James saw his appearances on major networks like NBC abruptly canceled without any official explanation. Even as his records were flying off the shelves, the corporate machinery began to pivot, pressuring sponsors to scale back advertising for his tours. When James attempted to strike back by filing a massive copyright infringement lawsuit against a major label in 1983, the industry launched a character assassination campaign. His genuine struggles with addiction were weaponized by the press, creating a narrative of a madman to overshadow the brilliant composer. This strategic framing ensured that while the public hummed his melodies, the establishment could justify his total professional excommunication. By the mid-1980s, Rick James had become a forbidden icon. Despite his immense influence on the sonic landscape, his music was labeled unsuitable for family programming, effectively ending his mainstream visibility. James famously remarked that he didn't create art to please the censors, but to keep them awake at night. The system's attempt to bury him in scandal nearly succeeded, but his influence proved too potent to be erased. His rhythms became the bedrock of 90s G-Funk. Rick James died in 2004, having paid a heavy price for his refusal to bow. His story serves as a stark reminder that in the music business, being a super freak is celebrated only until it threatens the rigid suburban comfort of the status quo. Ann Peebles. Ann Peebles was the reigning architect of the Memphis soul sound, a powerhouse whose precision and emotional depth transformed a rainy night into the timeless masterpiece, I Can't Stand the Rain. Her artistry was rooted in an uncompromising authenticity that celebrated the raw, unpolished textures of the Black experience. However, as the 1980s approached, the music industry shifted toward a highly synthesized crossover aesthetic that demanded Black female artists conform to a more suburban, pop-oriented veneer. Labels pressured Peebles to undergo a total image overhaul, shortening her hair, adopting dance floor trends, and most critically, softening her soul to sound less ethnic. Peebles, possessing a backbone of steel, famously rejected these demands, stating that she would not change her skin just to survive a fleeting trend. The industry's retaliation for her refusal to sanitize her soul was a masterclass in professional marginalization. Her upcoming projects were indefinitely shelved, and high-profile performances in major hubs like Detroit were abruptly canceled, with executives citing a strategic shift in artist direction. This was code for an institutional blockade. A former television director later admitted that internal memos flagged Peebles as no longer relevant because her image was too dark for the burgeoning MTV era. In a particularly jarring act of erasure, a 1982 recording session was hijacked by label officials. Midway through the process, the technical staff was replaced, and a younger pop-centric singer was brought in to record over Peebles' original tracks. Following this blatant attempt to rewrite her legacy, Peebles retreated to Memphis, severing ties with the corporate machinery that sought to edit her identity. The establishment attempted to paint her as a relic of the past, yet her influence remained indestructible, with legends like Missy Elliott and John Lennon citing her as a primary inspiration. She chose the dignity of silence over the humiliation of a manufactured persona, proving that an artist's soul is not a commodity to be traded for airplay. Ann Peebles' career remains a profound testament to the power of no. She may have been erased from the pop charts of the 80s, but she remains etched in the foundation of soul music as a woman who refused to betray herself for a paycheck. Syl Johnson. Syl Johnson was a formidable titan of the Chicago blues and soul circuit, a man whose gritty, piercing vocals birthed the definitive anthem of racial inequality, "Is It Because I'm Black?" While he possessed a jagged, emotive brilliance that influenced generations, his career became a protracted war against the industry's culture of theft. Johnson recognized early on that major corporations were systematically harvesting Black creativity without compensation. Unlike his peers, who remained silent, Johnson became the litigation warrior of the soul world, filing an unprecedented 72 lawsuits against the music industry's most powerful giants to reclaim his stolen royalties. This uncompromising quest for justice transformed him from a respected musician into an institutional pariah. The establishment's retaliation was an organized campaign of professional vanishing. Despite winning several landmark legal battles, Johnson suddenly found himself erased from the media landscape. High-profile television interviews were canceled at the 11th hour, and his records were intentionally relegated to the dusty backrooms of distribution centers. Most suspiciously, a feature-length documentary chronicling his life and his battle for artists' rights was sabotaged during post-production. An IT expert involved in the project revealed that the entire server containing the digital master files was inexplicably wiped. This wasn't a technical error, it was a digital assassination of his narrative intended to discourage other artists from challenging the industry's accounting practices. For decades, the industry operated under the assumption that Johnson had been successfully silenced, with label representatives even telling journalists they thought he was gone. However, Johnson's influence proved indestructible through the medium of hip-hop. He became one of the most sampled artists in history, with his rhythms forming the backbone of tracks by Wu-Tang Clan and Kanye West. Each time a modern beat utilized his sound, it served as a spiritual subpoena, reminding the world that the man they tried to bury was still breathing. Syl Johnson died in 2022, a victor who never lowered his sword, proving that while the industry can burn the books and delete the files, they can never truly own the soul of a warrior who knows his worth. Millie Jackson. Millie Jackson was the unapologetic architect of the R-rated soul revolution, a woman whose gravelly vocals and candid spoken-word monologues shattered every polite convention of the 1970s. She transformed the stage into a courtroom where she laid bare the complexities of infidelity, female desire, and financial independence. While her talent was immense, her refusal to be a polished lady for corporate consumption made her a primary target for institutional suppression. The industry viewed her as a volatile asset, too radical for the daytime radio market, and too honest for the conservative labels that sought to sanitize Black femininity. By 1979, the establishment began a coordinated campaign to classify her art as obscene, effectively cutting her off from mainstream distribution channels. The blacklisting of Millie Jackson was a masterclass in professional isolation. Despite sold-out shows, major television networks implemented a voice-only policy, refusing to film her performances while happily playing her records during late-night slots. This was a tactical attempt to profit from her sound while erasing her powerful, defiant image. An internal memo from a prominent broadcasting conglomerate later surfaced explicitly instructing regional directors to avoid any visual representation of MC or Jackson due to potential brand friction. When she attempted to launch her own production company to bypass these gatekeepers, her bank accounts were frozen under the guise of an administrative audit, a move many believe was intended to starve her of the resources needed for independence. By the time the 1980s pop era arrived, the industry had successfully relegated Jackson to the novelty category, ignoring the profound social commentary embedded in her soul. She was essentially a ghost in the high-definition era, as music video channels refused to air her content. Yet Millie Jackson remained unbowed, famously remarking that the system couldn't handle a woman who refused to be a victim in her own songs. Her influence paved the way for the raw honesty of hip-hop icons, proving that while the establishment can bury a person in silence, they can never truly kill the truth that lives in a woman's roar. She remains the patron saint of the unfiltered, a legend who paid the price of exclusion for the luxury of her integrity. Gene Chandler. Gene Chandler was the Duke of Earl, a title that symbolized his regal presence and his unrivaled command over the Chicago soul scene. His 1962 smash hit became a multi-million selling phenomenon, but Chandler's journey into the industry's shadow began when he transitioned from a mere entertainer into a staunch defender of racial dignity and creative equity. In 1966, during a high-stakes tour of the segregated South, Chandler led a historic protest against the theater circuit, a network of venues that forced Black artists to use back entrances and perform in subhuman conditions. His refusal to step onto a stage in Savannah, Georgia until the front doors were open to his crew sent shockwaves through the corporate offices of the booking agencies. The institutional retaliation was cold and methodical. Because Chandler had challenged the very infrastructure that facilitated black stardom, he was labeled militant and uncooperative. Major booking agencies, which held a monopoly over national venues, quietly removed his name from their rosters, a move that effectively severed his connection to his audience. An internal memo from a prominent talent agency later revealed a slow-burn strategy. They would not fire him outright, but they would ensure his tour dates were booked in obscure, failing venues to diminish his commercial stature. When Chandler attempted to circumvent this by founding his own label, Bamboo Records, the industry responded by pressuring distributors to misplace his shipments or claim inventory errors to prevent his records from reaching stores. This systematic erasure attempted to turn a sovereign artist into a footnote. By the late 1970s, despite releasing innovative disco soul fusion tracks, Chandler found himself excluded from major television showcases that he had once headlined. The establishment sought to bury the man who demanded to be treated like royalty, preferring compliant stars who didn't question the back entrance. Yet Gene Chandler remained unbowed, eventually finding a new home in the UK and European soul circuits, where his integrity was celebrated. He survived the blacklist by proving that true royalty isn't granted by a contract, but by the respect of a global audience that refuses to let a legend be forgotten. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack was the poet of soul, a gritty, raw-voiced genius who served as the bridge between the gospel fervor of the 1950s and the rock-infused funk of the 1970s. However, his standing within the music establishment was permanently fractured by a scandal that the industry weaponized to suppress his burgeoning influence. In 1965, just months after the tragic murder of his mentor, Sam Cooke, Womack married Cooke's widow, Barbara. While a personal decision, the industry used this perceived moral transgression to enact an unofficial but total blacklist. Radio DJs were reportedly encouraged to break his records on air, and for nearly 5 years, Womack became a professional untouchable, barred from the very airwaves his mentor had helped desegregate. The blacklisting of Bobby Womack was a masterclass in professional isolation. Major labels, fearing public relations blowback, refused to sign him as a solo artist, forcing one of the greatest songwriters of the century to work in the shadows as a session guitarist and ghostwriter. Even after he penned "It's All Over Now," which became a massive hit for the Rolling Stones, Womack was denied the promotional spotlight. An internal memo from a prominent distribution network later revealed that Womack was classified as unmarketable due to his controversial social standing. This was an institutional attempt to punish an artist for his private life by stripping him of his public voice, a tactic designed to ensure he remained a ghost behind other people's hits. Womack's eventual return to the spotlight with masterpieces like Across 110th Street and If You Think You're Lonely Now was a victory of sheer resilience over systematic erasure. He refused to provide the industry with the shame it demanded, continuing to produce music that was as raw and unapologetic as his life. Despite being excommunicated by the gatekeepers for years, his soulful DNA became so deeply embedded in American music that the blacklist eventually crumbled under the weight of his talent. Bobby Womack died in 2014, leaving a legacy that serves as a stark reminder: the industry can try to burn a man's reputation, but they can never silence a voice that carries the true fire of the soul. The legacies of these 17 titans prove that the music industry is as much a battlefield of control as it is a stage for talent. From the mysterious silencing of Donny Hathaway to the corporate erasure of Fontella Bass and the tactical suppression of Marvin Gaye, the pattern is undeniable. When black brilliance refuses to be bought, it is often buried. These legends didn't just lose airplay, they lost their identities to a system that prioritizes profit over people. Here at Black Excellence Legends, we ask you, is it ever possible to truly separate the art from the industry's dark politics? Or are we, as listeners, complicit in their erasure by remaining silent while the gatekeepers pull the strings?